Thank you everyone for coming. My name's Jon Gerrard, and welcome to this forum on Bill 64, a bill which will eliminate elected school boards in Manitoba and do a number of other changes to education. I'm going to start by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicated ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I would now like to introduce Dougald Lamont, our Manitoba Liberal leader, to provide some opening comments. Over to you, Dougald.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, everybody. It is an incredibly important bill that's come forward. And there are a number of things I'll just say that are really important for everybody to understand. First, it has not been passed yet. It's been held up till the fall. So all these changes, we still have some time to organize and get organized against the government and challenge the government on what they're trying to do. That's the first thing about this is not set in stone, even though the government might give the impression otherwise. The other thing that's really important about Bill 64 is that it has a lot of proposals in it that no one asked for. When it was released, the Bill 64 was released at the same day as the K-12 review. And the K-12 review was a consultation process with thousands of parents. I have children in the public school system. I was part of those consultations. And at the end of the day, they came up with legislation that went further and defied the recommendations of parents, educators, and their own experts. So that's also really important to know. And it is very, very important. I think that the government is nervous about this because this is a bill that will have an impact on every single community in Manitoba, every single one. It doesn't matter where you live. It's going to have a permanent effect on the way we teach children, on who gets to say, who has a say in how children are taught. And it is deeply undemocratic because it is stripping away local control and local input. In Steinbach, the chair of the Hanover School Division said, it looks like the government has decided to blow up the public school system with no plan to glue it back together. So when it comes to decisions like this, education is a core responsibility of the provincial government, and it is one of the most important things we have in society to lift people up. It is one of the great levelers, because I'm lucky enough, I went to school on a scholarship. My father did, my grandfather did. So we understand the importance of education and how it can lift people up. And that has to be the central commitment of any education system, of a public education system. And we're committed to making sure that our public education system is inclusive, that it does a great job of supporting students, including students who are in need. And finally, that it's public and that we all have a say, because we all have a stake in how important public education is for all of us. And that goes, and that is especially true. And I will just mention Judy Claussen, who's here today. It is also the case with education on reserve on First Nations. So there are places like the Waiwe-Sikapo Reserve, which has a direct connection with the local school board, and the ability of First Nation students to get funding and to be educated with the level of funding they should have is directly tied to our K-12 system as well. And there are lots of myths around this, but I just want to thank everybody for coming forward. I want to thank John and Wendy and Judy, Ben Carr, John Wiens, Cindy Lamoureux, and Shandy for putting this all together. And I will leave it to the experts from now. But do make sure, I will say we have one last thing. We do have a change.org petition. We hope to have we're calling for a referendum on this because I think it's too big of a question. And it was never part of the PC's plan and platform in 2019. If you're going to make huge decisions like this, they have to have a public mandate, and I don't think the government has that right now. So we'll share the change.org petition link to sign up, and I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, Dugald. We're now going to hear from our panelists. Just a couple of things beforehand. Each of the panelists will present, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. You can type in your question on the Q&A. There's also a chat function to have some discussion, but if you would like a question, put it on the Q&A and we'll ask those questions after we've heard from the panelists. We have 5 panelists. John Wiens, who's a former Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. Wendy Bloomfield, Chair of the Board currently of the Seine River School Division. Ben Carr, Principal of the Maples Met School in Seven Oaks School Division. Judy Claussen, a former MLA for Kiiwetinoong and former Liberal critic for education, and Cindy Lamoureux, MLA Tyndall Park and current education critic for Manitoba Liberals. I'll introduce each in more detail when each has their turn, but we're going to start with John Wiens. He's currently the Dean Emeritus, which is a former Dean at the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. He's a lifelong educator. He has served as a teacher, a counselor, a work education coordinator, principal, a school superintendent, and a university professor. Over to you, John, to provide us the first comments on Bill 64.
Hey, thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of you for coming. I absolutely agree with all of the comments earlier, and I thought that the kind of contribution I would make would simply be to give a bit of an overview of what I think are the key points, and then respond to those things. I'm actually not sure how familiar people are with Bill 64, but I actually think that we should comment on the BEST document, or what they call as Better Education Starts Today document, since it actually doesn't match up with the Education Review at all, or very little. So we have what's basically a flawed review, which led to this BEST document, which is also a flawed document, as I'm going to say. But the review itself might actually prove useful in the future. But at the moment, it was pretty well ignored when the government is working on a particular implementation. So it's actually, they're starting another round of consultations at the moment, and you really have to wonder how serious these consultations are, because they made a mockery of the first ones. So that's just kind of an opening statement. So I'm going to talk about 3 threats. I'm going to talk about what I think is the biggest political threat, and the biggest existential threat, and the biggest practical threat. And I know that my internet connection is probably a little dodgy from time to time, so I'm asking you to bear with me on this, because this sign keeps coming up once in a while saying that it's a bit of a problem. So the biggest political threat, I think, is the getting rid of the boards and their agents, which means the boards and all the superintendents. And what it does, what the centralization of power does, is in fact put more and more power into fewer and fewer hands. If we follow the BEST document, it basically puts the whole power within the Premier's hands. And that's pretty scary. So what we have in not only this bill, but in about 5 bills that we got coming forward, is a loss of participatory space, places for people to engage. That's a real threat. And not only that, it makes sure that the decisions are made far away from where people actually live and experience their education. And this has led to, I mean, we've got lots of evidence of this. This has led to these kind of prescriptive kinds of answers to very simple prescriptive answers to very complex local problems. In addition to that, this is really an attack on any kind of critique or dissent. It basically says anybody who doesn't agree with us, we actually don't need to pay any attention to and listen to at all. So I think that's a political threat. The practical threat, of course, is that, and this is maybe the good news, it's the people in education particularly, but none of us, I don't think, are just blind followers. And this stuff won't work. It won't save money. It won't address the real issues. They will actually go beyond what Dougal said to the point where they will tell us what to teach as well as how to teach. And so there's some of that in there. It will leave parents isolated and really disenchanted and, you know, resigned and to their fate perhaps, but resentful. And it will leave teachers and principals divided and unable to work together. Now, the biggest existential threat is the stuff that runs through all of this, in my view, is because truth and reason and a recognition of reality, which I would say is the evidence that this stuff will work, if you want to put it that way, is all reframed in terms of partisan politics. I mean, what we have going on now is particularly important with trustees is that by and large, they're nonpartisan. And so they don't get caught up in the partisan politics stuff. What they do get caught up in what their task is, which is educating young people. So we have deliberate lies and repetitious half-truths. And on top of that, a significant attack on public education and the principles and the ideals that are part of public education and of democracy, of course. So I'm going to stop at that. I hope that helps frame this discussion a little bit, and I'll turn it over to either questions or hearing the next person. Thank you.
Now, we're going to proceed with each of the presenters first, and then we'll be open to questions. So our next presenter is Wendy Bloomfield. She's the chair of the board of the Seine River School Division. She's also chair of the Child Nutrition Council of Manitoba. She was an administrator of a nonprofit childcare program for 16 years. She has served as a school trustee since 1983 and as chair of the board of the Seine River School Division since 1990. So she's got an extraordinary long time of experience. Wendy, over to you to give us a perspective from the view of the chair of a school board.
Okay, thanks, John. I think Shanti's going to put up a little brief slideshow. I have a lot to say, so I'm going to say it really quickly to try and stay within my time period. Just one sec here. So, thank you, John. The Bill 64, I'm calling the Education Demodernization Act. The announcement on March 15th by Minister Cullen and further statements by Premier Pallister have left me feeling stunned, hurt, and angry. Either Mr. Pallister doesn't have a very good understanding of what boards actually do, or he is choosing to ignore facts to achieve his intended purpose. What is being proposed is actually going to take Manitoba backwards instead of forwards. Over the past 38 years, I have been educated as to what it means to be an educator and spent countless hours learning and understanding how to improve education for children. Few of my thoughts. Slide, please. Firstly, these proposed changes won't benefit student learning. Modern research says that having strong system leaders such as superintendents, consultants, and principals who understand curriculum, what good instruction looks like, and who know areas where learning challenges exist are critical to overall system success. That means that system leaders must have the capacity to observe teaching and learning as it happens and not just make decisions from afar. The most effective system leaders are individuals who are first and foremost experienced educators, and secondly, who are visible in schools and classrooms on a regular basis. Having firsthand awareness of what goes on in the classrooms allows for closer collaboration with school teams and the ability to analyze and make decisions as to how best to support classrooms and schools, and ultimately to improve learning outcomes for students. In this proposed new model, principals will be operating as islands unto themselves, and I wonder how they will be able to provide the support for teachers that effective research identifies for system growth, especially when the new system appears to provide minimal to no educational support for principals. Slide, please. Secondly, this change will undermine the fundamental right of democracy. Locally elected school boards are a very grassroots level of democracy and what I believe to be the most important, not just because I'm a trustee, but because I believe that making decisions related to educating our future generations is where one truly can have the most impact. Education is not a business manufacturing motors that all look alike and all perform the same function. Education is about developing children's minds to be our future doctors and nurses, to be our future scientists who will develop the next vaccine, and yes, to be the future political leaders of our society. How can a centralized government-appointed education authority truly understand the intricacies and unique requirements of almost 700 public schools throughout Manitoba? The challenges within my own school division of 15 schools and over 100 kilometers from east to west are immense. Within my own community of St. Norbert, the needs of each school and classroom are vast. We have many families living in poverty to some of the most affluent. We have a high immigrant population, many from war-torn countries, and we have many students coming to us with exceptional needs. If it is difficult for my board to understand and adapt the resources required for each classroom, school, and community, how could one reasonably expect an appointed board based in Winnipeg to fully appreciate the requirements of all 690 Manitoba public schools? Slide, please. Thirdly, this change will promote equality, not equity. I first got elected during times when there was a lot of concern and mistrust between French and English factions in Seine River School Division. It took a lot of patience, lots of tears, and collective determination to overcome our differences and build a system that is based upon mutual trust and respect. Back in the 1980s, everything was 100% formula driven. Every line of every budget was calculated to ensure every school got exactly the same as every other school. That was equality. It actually did help to build trust, but it did nothing to address the educational needs of our schools. I'm proud to say today that my division works hard at promoting and living the pursuit of equity. What I mean by that is our board, with the assistance and recommendation of our superintendent and staff, make decisions that may provide more resources in one classroom than the resources provided for a classroom across the street. My fear is that the proposed changes will take us back to a purely formula-driven system, which will return to equality at the expense of equity and will ultimately leave our most disadvantaged children behind. Slide, please. So what could have been done? First of all, respect superintendents and assistant superintendents for what they are, the backbone of public education in Manitoba. Remove the commercial tax assessment from the education property tax bill and redistribute to school divisions on a per capita basis. Work with existing divisions, parents, and communities to strategically amalgamate more divisions, striving perhaps for optimal size divisions of 6,000 to 10,000 students in rural areas and 20,000 to 25,000 students in Winnipeg. Perhaps working with the Manitoba Association of School Superintendents to develop a workable administrative structure for rural divisions, as well as Winnipeg and Brandon. Perhaps ensuring no elected board had more than 7 trustees and consider developing a provincial indemnity bylaw. Removing the taxing authority for school trustees. Working collaboratively with divisions to establish strategic shared service agreements. This concept is included in Bill 64, however, at the macro provincial level. I believe shared service agreements would have a greater chance of success in more localized regional areas. And lastly, providing Department of Education support to monitor, evaluate, and recommend changes where required to improve division academic performance. Currently, support of this nature is non-existent at the Department of Education does not have any staff to undertake these types of tasks. Slide, please. In closing, I ask you, do we need to look at new strategies to improve our education system in Manitoba? Yes. Will the proposed Education Modernization Act achieve anticipated results? No. I became a trustee to make a difference in the school system so that our children would be able to learn and grow and have the skills necessary to achieve whatever their future may bring. But we need to do this right, not for the sake of someone's political whim, but for the sake of our children and the sake of our future. Thank you.
Wendy, thank you very much. You provided detailed comment, critique on Bill 64, but you also were very helpful in suggesting a number of potential solutions. Next, our next presenter is Ben Carr, who is the principal of the Maples Met School, one of only 2 Met schools in Canada. The Maples Met School was named the top school in Canada for innovation in teaching and learning last year by the Education Canada Network. Formerly, Ben was a teacher at Kelvin High School. Over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I think I always get nervous when John Wiens is around because I remember my first year teaching grade 6. I found out on the first day that the Dean of Education at the University of Manitoba's granddaughter was in my classroom. So, and that was John Wiens. So really nice to be back with him and thank him for his ongoing contributions. I wanted to take the few moments I had this afternoon to talk about a couple aspects of the bill that I think require further scrutiny and require our collective effort to bring to the attention of the public at large. And then I also want to speak to one area in particular where I think there's actually an opportunity for growth, where we can take advantage of this window of change that's coming. Echoing some of the things that Wendy and John have both said already, I think one of the most substantial areas of concern is in the abolition of school boards. And the reason for this is that the decentralization of decision-making, which puts the authority into the hands of government appointees who are removed from the grassroots, is problematic for a variety of different reasons. One of them is that schools are very much rooted in community. And communities are distinct, they are unique. They have their own cultures, they have their own needs, they have their own set of desires, and those things are only able to be responded to if people understand what those things are. And what I've found in my time in the Seven Oaks School Division, a school division which is heavily represented by a diverse community, a lot of newcomers to Canada, and a lot of kids who are in our care. And those two communities in particular do not have the same set of needs to be set up for success as those who are living in different parts of the province, just like those who are living in Steinbach or in the Pembina Trails School Division or up north in Manitoba don't have the same set of needs as the students that are living in our community. So I worry that the decentralization of that decision making away from people who understand that need is going to be significantly problematic moving into the future. The second is anybody that's involved in education knows that the most important thing in education is relationships. And that includes relationships between students and their teachers, between teachers and their principals, between schools and parents, between parents and trustees and superintendents and all of those that are involved in making decisions in our system. I worry that if we have an appointed board of 15 or so individuals, as Wendy said, based in Winnipeg, who don't necessarily have a background and expertise in education, who are far removed from an understanding of the unique needs and distinctiveness of each community, that we're going to lose so much of what is needed in order to set kids up for success. And that's in the understanding of things which we build through relationship. I have the opportunity in my school division as a principal, for example, to pick up the phone and call my superintendent at any time if I have an issue that I need to respond to. Parents in our community are able to pick up the phone and call trustees and within the same day be able to address problems. I wonder where the lines of communication are going to be and what ability we're going to have for people to have needs responded to when we have this centralization of decision-making authority and we have a breaking apart of the relationships, which are very much the cornerstone of what we do today. And the last is that I worry a little bit in the decentralization about the stymieing of innovation. The Maples Med School, which I'm very proud to be the principal of, was established in part through the vision that our superintendent and our board had because they were responding to a particular need of the community. Med schools, which belong to a network of education called Big Picture Learning, of which there are about 200 schools in the world, were established in the mid-90s in Providence, Rhode Island. And they were established because there was a recognition that school wasn't working for everybody. Traditional public school wasn't working for everybody. And in our division, there was a recognition that that was true for many of our students, and that by being able to offer choice, by being able to offer a different way in which people could approach education, thereby responding to the needs of people in our community who were marginalized in many different ways, we were able to offer something that was positive for them. I worry that schools like mine, which have been tremendously successful in providing opportunities for growth for our students and our families and our community, would not have been possible if we were living under the proposed governance structure. The second thing in particular I want to mention, which is very concerning for me, probably the most concerning, is around standardization. We've already seen post-secondary institutions talking about what's happening within their faculties and their student body as the provincial government is starting to tie funding to results. And there's a couple of reasons I think that this is particularly problematic. One is that research shows us that as early as grade 2, students will start to have a narrative of themselves, an identity of themselves that is tied to their performance as students in school. And that is most often tied to a numerical value, a grade, which all of us are used to. I think my dad might be on this call, and he would know that that math was never my particular specialty in school. And it took me a long time because I was always made to feel as though I didn't have any skill set in mathematics because I saw myself as a D student or a C student in mathematics, and that it wasn't tied to a variety of different other strengths and skills I had as an individual. I worry that if we're talking about having public schools have to produce results which are tied to standardized tests, that we're going to create unnecessary competition, which is going to lead to families shopping for the best schools, which is going to further compound the negative aspects of inequities that we find in an already very inequitable system. I worry that it's going to lead to a derailing of the focus on developing a holistic individual where we can account for growth in a myriad of different ways that aren't just tied to numerical values in grades, and that we're going to be taking students and putting them into pressure-packed situations to study for things that are really not consistent with the way in which we learn best. Anybody that's looking for a great book to read, which I just happen to have right here, is called The Art of Changing the Brain. And it's a wonderful example of how the research has shown time and time again, particularly in schools in the United States, where this type of conservative approach to education has been promoted and implemented, is that students don't remember. They don't latch on and create meaning to these type of standardized tests. And I worry very much about what that means for the future. The last thing I would say about where we have an opportunity, I think, is that the Met School model, and for those that don't know, the kind of Coles Notes is that on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, our students are with us doing project-based work in a smaller setting with a ratio of 1 advisor, the teacher, to 15 students, and largely founded in projects. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're learning experientially, being out in the community doing internships which are centered around their passions and their interests. This is one of the rare models of education where I actually believe that a progressively minded person and a conservative minded person can have their thoughts converge. They come at it from different ways. The progressive person, I like to think of myself as such, sees that this is how kids learn best and that this is a really profoundly important way for kids to approach their education. The conservative minded person sees it as a fast track to getting a job. But nonetheless, there is a convergence here. And I think for those that may have seen in the news recently, the Seven Oaks School Division is going to be opening up a third med school. I have lots of people in our network that we've worked with in the past number of years through med school internships who are supporters of the government, who are conservative-minded people who see the value of this type of education. So I think that there is an opportunity for us to be able to say, hey, there are things that are working. Let's come to the table and talk about it. And yes, there are significantly problematic aspects of this bill, but let's also sit down and engage and talk about the things that are working in this system and figure out how we can scale that up. And I think the big picture learning model is an example of one of those opportunities.
Thank you very much, Ben. You've provided us a window to look at the Met School and the opportunities and the changes that are being proposed, and not only raised concerns over a number of those changes, but have also suggested some interesting opportunities. Thank you. Our next speaker is Judy Claussen. Judy is the former MLA for Kiiwetinoong. She served from 2016 to 2019. Both her parents were teachers and taught in the North. Judy herself was the education critic for a year or so for the Manitoba Liberals while she was an MLA. And Judy has also served for, I think, about a year on the council at St. Teresa Point. And that council deals with education and the First Nations level. So Judy has perspectives from a number of different directions. Over to you, Judy, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, and thanks to everyone for listening in today. Happy Sunday, everyone. So I have a number of questions and mostly downright fear as to what's going to happen within education for Indigenous people here in Manitoba. You know, like my kudos always to teachers out there. They do an amazing job, you know, both, as John stated. I come from parents who are both teachers, and I always say that's why I never wanted to be one, because I know how hard that job is. So starting off, you know, the Indigenous people of Manitoba are leaders who are not that older than me. They fought really hard to get learning back into the hands of our people. It was all assimilation policies and government run. And it happened in my generation where local control began. And we never really got the full go ahead. And it was just fight after continuous fight to try and get education into our own hands. And now to see the prized items that that my sister is currently a teacher right now, you know, she's scared. Teachers in the reserves are scared because they don't know what this means for the kids in the classroom. You know, they're still grappling with trying to get funding, extra funding for books and extra funding for simple items that they need. And Brian Pallister doesn't have the greatest record when it comes to Indigenous people. And we've seen it time and time again in his policies. You know, the Indigenous people are rarely mentioned in this new bill. And it's just very, you know, it's very scary, because we're gonna yet again get totally neglected and ignored, and everything is just, he's just probably gonna pass us off to the federals. And it's quite frightening because we're also Manitobans. And so there needs to be accountability to our people in trying to get us up to par. You know, we can't even, that's one of our wishes, is to get at least up to par with everybody else in Manitoba. You know, some kids, they're still grade 3, they're only learning how to read in some First Nations. You know, it was wonderful to unprecedented funding from the federal government in the reserves that I took care of. Never before seen schools, infrastructure, coming into some of the reserves I took care of, and it's amazing. But now what? You know, the root cause of what we want to see for our own people in our schools, that's just going to be completely wiped away, because sure, they might appoint an Indigenous person on this group that's supposedly going to be in control. But I've personally seen, when I first got in, you know, I had Indigenous friends that were put in as major, like, assistant ministers. And I'm not going to name names, because one by one, they all quit. And there was a reason why they quit. And unfortunately, and that's why I can't name names, because I'm not allowed to share. But, you know, they were token Indians, as the term is called. And it's very frustrating, because they had brilliant ideas. A lot of us were so hopeful that these people would be able to speak for our people, because they were our people. But one by one, they all ended up leaving those positions. And again, fear. You know, the word decentralization has been thrown around a lot, but I see it again as being centralized, and another assimilation policy coming to our people. And it's just very scary. You know, I'm just wondering, where's the report? What was so wrong with the system that was in place? You know, I didn't hear of any, as critics, people complaining about the way things were going. So I was just curious as to why all of a sudden, now that they're trying to get rid of all these vital places. Like, my kids were in Hanover School Division most of their lives, and it was wonderful. You know, I was part of the parent advisory councils in each school, because all my kids were all spread out, high school, elementary, and middle school, and it was nice. We had a way to get together and voice to our trustees what we would like to see. And how is that going to happen? They're just going to be completely flooded out. You know, it's just another way to scare us and keeping our future uncertain. And these are trying times right now. And now we have to add this to our plates. And it's very frustrating. And we need answers. And we know, we've all seen it before, time and time again. They skirt the issue. They give us answers that are not answers. And it's just very fearful what's going to be happening. You know, I like Wendy's idea of the equalization, because, you know, as Manitoba, you know, Brian Pallister goes and stands in that welfare line too. He gets equalization transfers, and he's able to, as a province, we're able to get more funding because of our position compared to other provinces. So why can't we do that? I really like that idea, because we're just finally getting some of our lessons, some of the direly needed teachings into the school systems. You know, Seven Oaks, where Rebecca Chartrand was instrumental in bringing our language back into those schools. And that was, you know, there was a lot of people that were trampled and hurt, and now it's finally come to fruition, and those people are still with us, and they're so proud that those kinds of things are coming into the schools. And now with a new system in place, are we going to go back to square one, where we have to literally fight tooth and nail to try and get some of the Indigenous curriculum into the curriculum? You know, I have to go to university to finally learn about Indigenous people. And so today, my daughters, I have 4 daughters, we're scared to death every time we go into a public place in the city. We're scared to death every time we get pulled over, if we happen to get pulled over. You know, we don't know. We could just be walking down the street, our brothers could just be walking down the street and they get shot because there's not enough education about why we are in these positions that we're in currently, why our brothers and sisters are lying on the ground throughout Winnipeg. People don't know what we have been through. It's been largely hidden, and there's beautiful teachers that were bringing this to light. And with this tiny little board that's going to oversee all of Manitoba, those stories are going to, our fear is those stories are going to go hidden once again. And so, you know, I'm going to do my best to share that change petition. And I really appreciate everybody's thoughts and opinions. And I really appreciate us getting together and addressing this bill. It's a scary bill. Thanks to everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much, Judy, for providing a perspective from your life as an Indigenous person in St. Teresa Point here in Manitoba. Now, our next presenter is Cindy Lamoureux. She's the current member of the legislature for Tyndall Park, and Cindy is our education critic, and she's been speaking up forcefully in the Manitoba legislature for education and for people in Manitoba. Cindy, over to you.
All right, thank you. And I just want to start off by thanking Dr. Gerrard for hosting today's forum, as well as all the panelists. And just a few points that I think are worth reiterating are, Jon, your points about the education review not being considered in all of these changes by the government. It's hugely important that we are aware of that. Highly unsatisfactory. Wendy, I love the title Demodernization, as it's totally correct. Bill 64 is a huge step backwards. And I also really appreciate that you brought forward solutions, ideas that we could be striving for. Ben, big thank you for the work you're doing with Met School. I'm a huge fan of Met Schools, for talking further about decentralization of decision-making. School decisions should be driven by grassroots needs. We know them the best. And Judy, you've raised such important points. There's so much confusion around this legislation and people have questions, and this government isn't giving and providing answers. It has caused fear, and this legislation shows no accountability. I also just want to thank you for bringing so many of the challenges Indigenous people are still facing to our attention within the education system. So we need to continue hearing it and sharing the reality of it. Now, I'm sure many of you know this Pallister government has a terrible track record for education in our province, between raising tuition fees, taking away healthcare for international students, forcing post-secondary students or schools to make cuts, and keeping money from schools during a pandemic when teachers have had to work triple time, online, in person, gathering resources, being adaptable with their curriculum, and risking their own health. I've yet to actually connect with someone involved in education here in the province who has been happy with any of these changes. So because of this track record with recent education legislation, we felt that Bill 64 was sort of like the last straw. And I'd like to explain why I understand this to be true as the education critic. Ultimately, we want students to succeed. And there are major concerns that Bill 64 is actually taking us in the wrong direction. According to a study in 2002 by International Surveys Associates, there are three major components that contribute to the best opportunities for students and their futures. The first, and if you do a quick Google, notable component to predicting a student's success, and this is aside from our basic needs of food, sleep, and shelter, and so forth, the first component is families and parents. How they encourage and they create opportunities to learn from home and engage in their children's school lives. Students need to know that they have home support and accountability to finish assignments and develop a love of learning. If parents do not take this seriously, how are we to expect children to? And this legislation, Bill 64, discourages parental involvement. The next component to healthy learning and engagement for students in the schools is the community. Now, we've heard quite a bit about this already from a couple of speakers. By having community involvement, schools have more opportunities for short and long-term benefits, as well as a sense of safety. Community engagement and involvement may look like volunteerism. Everything from working in the lunchroom, leading a patrol team, creating opportunities for students to volunteer at your workplace, speaking to classrooms, tutoring. There's many different opportunities. And another form of community engagement are donations. Donations are valued as they often fund field trips, learning tools, and uniforms, just as a few examples. And again, Bill 64 discourages community involvement the way it does parental involvement, and it takes away opportunities for local community members to be involved. The last and extremely important component that evidently relates to a student's success through education are our phenomenal school administrators, teachers, faculty, and staff. And anyone who is a teacher or who is currently working in our schools right now will know that this government has not been kind to our school system. And I don't want to go down this road too much because it doesn't pertain to Bill 64, but I did want to take a quick moment to really thank all of our teachers and everyone working in the school system. It is unbelievable the adaptability that those who are working in the education system have demonstrated with such last-minute decisions and little resources that they've been given. And you know what, I would actually argue that teachers are negatively affected by Bill 64 too, because it is one more potential barrier between teacher and parent communication. So ultimately, aside from our basic needs, the three most important components to a child's success in education are parents, community, and teachers. And Bill 64 disrupts and hurts all of these. So on that note, I do want to end my remarks here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to hang around too long. I'll be around for a short bit, but I want to extend a big thank you to everyone who is in attendance, to all of our panelists, and I believe opening this time up for questions. John, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep. No, thank you so much, Cindy. That was really good and summarizing some of the things. We will now open things up to questions. And David Mintz, I think you've been gathering some of the questions. Can you read some out, and then we'll get some responses for panelists. Read several out so that we can get more questions in.
Sure thing. We have going back a while now, so thank you for your patience. Christy asked, just wondering if and when the media will start referring to people in education as just that, not just teachers. Charlene asks, what constitutional right does a government have in being able to force out a group from a union when they want to stay? A recent referendum at MTS showed that principals overwhelmingly want to be part of the teachers union and not separate. Similarly, Kathy asks, is this bill actually legal? Is there ability to take this to court? And how can we change the mind of a government who is already closed-minded and determined to destroy the province and its people? Go, Kathy. Lloyd Talbot asks, how do we address current inequities that exist between schools and school divisions?
Okay, that's 4 questions, and I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Who would like to respond, and you can raise your hand if you like. Let me ask Wendy to tackle the question of principals and teachers union and helping those who are disadvantaged.
Well, I don't myself understand how they can force the principals out of a union that they willingly want to be a part of. And I imagine, I can't speak for them, but I imagine that Manitoba Teachers Society is likely going to fight that. I really don't understand it at all. And there was reference in one of the comments, I believe, by the Minister of Education about, it will separate more of the managerial role. But teachers work in a system that's very collaborative, and I think it'll just set up a very adversarial system between teachers and principals, and it will serve no purpose at all. So I hope MTS proceeds with that. What was the second part? Sorry.
Was about making sure that those who are disadvantaged can have a good education.
Well, this is probably one of my biggest concerns, as I said in the third sort of aspect of my presentation, is the feeling, I'm certain, that we are going to go back to equality versus equity. And we need to be striving for equity so that children that need more supports are given the supports that they're required to have in order to be successful. And if we go back to a centralized system where decisions are based with 6 to 11 people in an office in Winnipeg somewhere, how can they truly understand the needs of individual kids in classrooms? And I'll give you an example. A K-4 school in my division in St. Norbert, we have 3 grade 1-2 classrooms. Each one of those classrooms has 3 children who are nonverbal in it. Now, if you compare the same size classroom in another school with the same number of students in the classroom, you need extra supports, and there needs to be a mechanism to be able to provide those extra supports to make sure that kids can be as successful as possible. And if we go back to just purely formula-driven systems, I think that need for those kids is going to be in jeopardy.
Okay, thank you. John Wiens, can you tackle this question of whether this bill is legal? Could it be challenged?
Well, I've argued all along that it could be challenged, and I think I've argued in the past as well that school trustees are in fact another level of government, and therefore should not be able to be removed kind of summarily by another level of government. However, the legislation, I think, suggests, even the previous the legislation we're currently living under suggests that ministers and governments, in fact, have the power to do this. So I'm not sure that there's a legal challenge of that. I think there may very well be a legal challenge of the union question. On the other hand, I think it's unfortunate because the MTS is actually in negotiations, in my view at least, with the government to say we're going to have 2 unions instead of 1 union. And the problem with this is that it sets people, almost like the firefighters and the first responders, sets people against each other because they are expected to have competing visions of what's important. And all of these things actually deny the reality. I mean, where principals are not in the union, where they've been taken out of the union, has resulted in endless contention and the complete loss of the collegiality that exists now in our school system. I mean, Ben is perfectly right. If he didn't work together with his teachers in a relationship the way he does, there's no possible chance that he could achieve the things that he set out to, that he talked about and talked about achieving. I want to throw one other thing there. I was fairly brief at the beginning, but what I think we need to know, Wendy knows this probably as well as anybody does, but rural areas particularly are being thrown under the bus here. And the bus is a good analogy in the sense of, if we keep on the path we're on now, then in fact all our divisional employees at the board level and our bus drivers and our custodians and stuff who are now in unions and in unionized systems will, in fact, we've seen this before in health, they'll lose their jobs, they'll be able to reply for for 2/3 of the salary that they were getting before. Their work will be contracted out, right? And you know, we're moving in a direction which, in fact, creates more poor people than we had before. So it's just a huge problem. And you know, just to comment on Judy's, I mean, the perfect example of how to do things better would be the First Nations school system, which is done voluntarily. People opted in voluntarily. They support each other. They collaborate. They do amazing kinds of things, and we could look to them for some real answers here. So I know I rambled a bit.
Okay, thank you. Ben, did you want to comment on the principal issue?
Well, a couple of things actually, John, if I can, to the inequity piece. You know, one of the things the media loves to pick up on, Nick Martin used to write about this all the time, and the public seems to have just taken it for granted, is we talk about the system as being a failure. And typically what's rooted in that is that people say, well, we don't perform well on international standardized tests. That is the number one thing that people correlate with why our system is a failure. And I think it's really, really important that we take a look at what these tests set out to accomplish, who they serve, what purpose they serve. We've got 12,000 kids in this province who live in our care. We've got communities that have child poverty rates of over 60%. We have significant mental health issues, which are a result of a variety of different factors, inclusive of intergenerational trauma, poverty, unemployment, and health issues. We look at a lot of the concerns that Judy knows very well in northern communities around things like diabetes. It's really, really important that we ask ourselves in the context of this conversation, is the way that we're going to create, and we have to, John talks about this a lot, and we probably don't have the time to get into it today, but we actually have to take a step back in this conversation and say, what's the purpose of public education? If we don't answer that question, then we're going to have a very difficult time picking apart what it is that we feel is wrong about this bill and what we need to add. But what's really, really important, I think, to think about is our standardized tests as one example of the revisions that are being proposed in this legislation going to deal with the kid as an example of whom I have many in my school, who wakes up in the morning from a home with a single parent with 3 or 4 siblings that they need to take care of, who is battling significant mental health issues, who's having trouble holding a job, who doesn't have the ability to navigate the public healthcare system, who doesn't have the ability to provide the type of care that they need because the system and a variety of different systems have failed them for decades and decades and decades. And we're saying that the best way that we're going to address that is by putting some set of standard questions that's commonly believed to be beneficial in an international platform in front of them, and that's our solution. So I think that we actually have to stop taking for granted that the system is failing. The system can be improved, and there are certainly aspects of the system that are not meeting the needs of students. We have to be very careful about just taking for granted where this accusation of failure is coming from. And where we do need to find improvements in inequities is not going to be found, as I say, in either standardization or in, and I apologize earlier, I've been saying decentralization. What I'm really meaning to say is centralization. We're not going to find solutions in the centralization of decision-making authority. So I think when it comes to inequities, just one last thing I would add in all of this is we have to talk about the funding model. And I think that there's actually a really good opportunity here to change the funding model, and they've talked about it. But if we're going to have education be funded through general revenue, removing it from property taxes, we can't just be funding it at below the rate of inflation. It's okay to change, in my view, the source of the funding, as long as that funding is increasing to be responsive to the needs of the system. So I think that's a really, really important piece for us to be mindful of as well. Schools are places that people trust. By and large, because of those relationships that are founded. In my utopian view of schools in the future, we've got nurses and doctors and healthcare professionals and tax clinics and all the things that are needed to buoy communities centralized in hubs that are inclusive of schools, that aren't just the walls where we're doing the traditional academic, but where we're bringing all the needs of community together. That's how we're going to deal with inequity in the system.
Thank you. Judy, do you want to comment from a First Nations perspective and addressing equities?
Sure. One of the things that they're teaching up north right now is how to snare a rabbit. And can you imagine if we brought that teaching down south for all the Winnipeg School Division? I'm pretty sure there'll be a lot of kids crying, but it's a necessity for us up there. And I usually like to ask this question whenever I'm invited into a forum. My dad, when he was a child, he would go collect eggs for breakfast for his siblings. He was the oldest, so that was his job. And in that, if you can raise your hands, how many people thought of your first thought that popped into your head was him going out to a chicken coop? Anybody think that? Yeah, exactly. Meanwhile, that's not the case at all. He had to go literally to ponds to go and look for the migratory birds that come around, and it's either goose eggs or duck eggs or even robin's eggs and stuff like that. And if you got there early enough, the next day there'd be another egg. But that was his teaching, right? And so, you know, just different perspectives, and a lot of people don't understand. You know, we have to take it all the way back to see why we're trying to get back to ensuring that you guys look at it through an Indigenous worldview, that we have different perspectives, completely different. And ours is not primitive. It's not underdeveloped. It is right for our people, because that's what we need to be learning, and that's what our kids need to be learning. And it's unfortunate that, you know, we're scared that this is going to be taken away from us. And, you know, I just wanted to reiterate that fact that we have a different worldview, and we would like to share it as much as we can. Our collaborative nature, that's how we always were in the beginning, and that's what we really need to get back to be able to lift up our counterparts here in the city that are stuck here. You know, our goal is to eventually get back to the way we once were, because our methods were golden. Like, we never knew of poverty back then. We never knew of suffering. We never knew of housing shortages. You know, we were always in this collaboration, lived for one another and took care of one another. And, you know, it was when all these policies came and started breaking us up as family units. You know, we want to go back to that. Obviously, it'll never go back to exactly the way it once was, because of how the world has changed. But that is the goal. The goal is to teach people to care for one another the way we used to, and to be able to survive the way we once used to, because it was a beautiful way of life. And I just wanted to say again to everyone, thanks for joining together to try and combat this. You know, pray like crazy to hopefully it gets killed, but you know, we've got to start looking for solutions, because we've seen it time and time again where they propose these preposterous bills, and they are in majority. And so prepare for the worst at the same time, but cause a lot of attention to it, because it's gonna be sad.
Okay.
And I say that with a smile.
Okay, thanks so much, Judy.
Thank you.
John, a brief comment, and then we've got some more questions from David.
Well, just the comment is basically this, and Judy hit the nail on the head, I think, and Ben and Wendy did as well, that equity has a lot to do with how we respond to people at where they actually live. If they actually, you know, they don't have to live the same way as everybody else does, but they choose to live a certain way, and together with their friends and neighbors can choose a way of life which to them looks equitable and actually serves their purposes. And that can never be actually achieved from some deep outside source.
Okay, thank you. David, can you give us some more questions?
Sure, we are getting some questions coming through the chat, so I'll try to grab those, but just to make sure we do see it, try to put your questions in the Q&A. We have a question here from Lynn Frost. Cannot the Liberals and the NDP call out the PC party on this bill? Heather Rose asks, similar to the med school in Ben Carr's division, I teach at an alternative education school, and I'm also the divisional career development teacher for our division. I'm very concerned about the 15 appointees' knowledge of all of the different types of alternative and career development programs we currently run in our area of the city. Has anyone on the panel heard of any details about how these curricula, which also cater to the marginalized students, will be run/governed? And then Chris asks, Bill 64 is supposed to give more parents through through parent councils. Instead, I think that the structure of Bill 64 is going to put school principals in the position of managing the concerns of parent councils while needing to follow the directives of the new Board of Education. How do the panelists, particularly Ben Carr, think the new structure will affect the relationship between parents, teachers, and principals? And then we have one last one here, as we are on the cusp of a dramatic shift in our society, such as AI, climate change, automation. How will we prepare our youth to handle not only these situations, but the ethical dilemmas they create if we demodernize our education system? I'm very concerned.
Okay. Ben, why don't you start with a question of the role of principals in the future?
Sure. Thanks. That's a really important question. Parental involvement is critical in the success of schools and in children's success. But I don't think that the proposed changes for fostering further involvement of parents is going to tackle the issue. A couple of things that I think are concerning. The first is that they're talking about there being elected councils for every single school where parents will have the ability to, and I'm paraphrasing here, evaluate the performance of staff, evaluate school success, and be able to contribute to the overall direction that the school is going to take. I think one of the most important things for John, Dugald, and Cindy to continue pushing in the legislature is questions around that. What do they mean by that? It's very important that we receive some clarity. Where I'm concerned is in a couple of areas. The first is, as the person who asked the question indicated, what is the relationship going to be between administrators and educators and parents? Is this going to push us into an adversarial role as opposed to a collaborative one that has the best interests of our kids in mind? I'm imagining the situation where you've got a couple of really vocal parents who have some time on their hands, which not all parents do, who would be benefiting from this particular structure, would have the ability to run really public, perhaps nasty campaigns for positions on these parent councils. And what does that mean for the collegiality and collaboration that's going to be necessary for our success? But the biggest issue for me is this, and this is a hypothetical, but I think it's a very real possibility, and I think it's much more concerning in rural areas. What happens when the duly elected member of the parent council from my school, given funding and a mandate from the government, yet to be clarified as to what that will be, tells me that they don't like that a pride flag hangs in our school's common room? What will my ability to defend the values, the beliefs, the interests of my kids to be learning in a safe, inclusive, respectful environment be against the wishes of that parent, even if that parent is perhaps in the minority of views that exist in a particular community? And this is something that any educator can speak to, because we get this. In fact, I've had this recently, conversations with people who are worried about the ways in which we create inclusive environments for kids. So for me, that's a really, really big question. And I do think, and Dugald and I have talked about this a little bit recently, there are a lot of people in my network who believe that this is very much about the government trying to provide an opportunity for pretty conservatively minded individuals in certain communities the opportunity to have an easy out on things like gay-straight alliances and other things that create progressive and inclusive environments for our kids. So that's, for me, probably the most concerning area. And I think that we have to continue to ask questions about what they think this is going to look like. And I think parents need to continue to comment. And for anyone that didn't read Carl de Geer's piece in the Free Press a couple of weeks ago on this, I would suggest taking a peek, because I think there were a lot of fair points that were made in that.
Thank you. Anybody else on those questions? How are we going to address climate change and things like that in the future, John Wiens?
It's exactly one of the things that actually appears in the review, is this question about how do you deal with these, with the kind of neocolonialism. How do you deal with the issues of kind of racist tendencies that seem to have grabbed hold and gotten more foothold in our communities? How do you deal with the issues that Ben raised? How do you deal with the kind of large issues and so on? And I think that Ben raises an important point. We have a group of people out there who seem to have this government's ear, who actually don't believe in climate change. They don't believe in vaccination. They don't believe in wearing masks. They don't believe in doing it. And those people have now been given what would they say, a soapbox. And they've also been given, they've been legitimized, when in fact we should not be, as a society, legitimizing their stances, nor actually moving. Even though I'm very supportive of having a wide open spaces and wide open spaces. This is what I talked about as my existential threat. But if truth doesn't prevail, then we're in trouble. If, you know, lies do prevail, then we're equally in trouble. If people actually ignore or make sure that they're not exposed to realities, you know, then we're in trouble. And we have the group of people who seem to have the government's ear at the present time are exactly those people who are in the United States. We watch them. They're the conspiracy theorists, or they're the anti-climate change people. They're the anti-this, anti-this, and the white Anglo-Saxon principles group, right? So I think this about what we teach becomes a really important question here as well. You know, that people should not be able to opt out of some very important societal questions. I think this bill actually, and some of the things that are in it, allow people to do that. Now, I'm particularly not fond of some of the small private schools that we have and of homeschooling, because that's exactly what people are doing. They opt out, they indoctrinate their kids in certain kinds of ways. And these people don't see themselves as actually engaging their neighbors. In fact, the opposite is the case. They do not wish to engage their neighbors in solving the issues which are important to all of us. So how do we teach those things? Well, I mean, my answer is always, I guess, to teachers when I talk to them is, oh, you have to be a little subversive, right? You're really bright people. You actually are very ingenious of getting the stuff that needs to be talked about into the classrooms. Kids will ask you questions. You can say, kids are asking me questions. I need to answer them. And children ask these kinds of questions. Young people ask these kind of questions all the time. And teachers have lots of opportunities to answer them. What we have to make sure is that they're not shut up, and they're not throttled. They're not, you know, we don't throw too many roadblocks in their way or create too much fear to allow them to talk about those things out loud. My son, for example, is a teacher in Churchill. virtually every day, no day goes by when he doesn't talk about indigeneity and what that would mean if we looked at things through different eyes, and we are doing that now, right? It's going to be pretty hard to stop him, right? Unless there's some principal who appointed by, and this is a possibility here, some principal appointed by a provincial organization who says, if you do that again, you're going to be fired. You know, this is how, I'll put it straight. This is how evil some of this stuff is. It's as evil as that. Yeah. You know, this whole kind of thing that you can somehow direct this thing from some kind of central place, along with all the biases that come with that central place. This is hugely problematic, and it actually is destructive of our school system and eventually of our society. And you know, basically the United States right now is going through the throes of doing what these people are doing to us in Manitoba. And
thank you.
See how divided they are.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I'm going to have one last round of questions, David, if you can give them, and I'll give Wendy and Judy the first crack at the answering to this group. David.
Okay, so these are a number of questions that came through from the chat. How will this bill affect the unique needs of Hutterite schools and Indigenous cultural programs in my area? Where will the funding for education come from, if not from property taxes? If it's based on income, then those who can write off income will not be taxed accordingly, and those who are living paycheck to paycheck may bear the brunt. In any case, it seems underfunding will be severe. People will seek private school, further driving the underfunding. Third question is, I would like, Bill 64 leads to a significant brain drain throughout our education system. Teachers are retiring sooner than planned, principals are returning to classrooms, and senior administration and boards are losing their voice and may be soon lost from the system entirely. Who will be left to speak on behalf of our students' successes and continue to lead what does work? And a final question, please include a comment on the end of 60-minute bus ride caps and also potential closure of rural schools with no meaningful parent involvement.
Okay, Wendy, tell us about things like brain drain and rural school division 60-minute caps. You've got a partly rural school division.
Well, actually, I'm probably mostly rural. St. Norbert is the only area of Seine River that is urban. The rest is all rural. Certainly the cap on losing the cap on the 60-minute bus ride is concerning. We've already got a number of routes that are right at the 60 minutes, and on a bad winter driving day, probably beyond 60 minutes. And that is really concerning. In our area, our schools are at or over capacity, so we would not be in a position of probably having schools closed. But there are a number of areas in Manitoba and rural communities where I'm certain that lifting the moratorium on the closure of schools is going to have an impact on those rural communities. And that's a loss for the community. It's a loss for the economy of a community. There's a lot of concerns that I'm hearing from colleagues in more rural divisions than what mine is. The brain drain is very real. We had an assistant superintendent who we weren't in a position to hire, but we were able to put somebody in as an interim for 1 year. He's already asked to go back to a principalship in the fall just because it's far more secure. I know that there are superintendents in the province that have already accepted jobs outside of Manitoba already because they know that they're likely not going to have a position. One of the things that I think a lot of our senior administrators are facing too is there's currently what the province is calling an expression of interest. So they're all of the current superintendents and assistant superintendents are being asked to express to the province whether they would like to, work in the new system. Well, the dilemma they're faced with is, do I want a job that is going to make me work in a system that I don't support because it's wrong for kids, it's wrong for education, or do I go without a job? And that's a huge dilemma for people that have worked their whole lives, and they're at the point of maybe 3 to 5 years to retirement, and it's a huge concern for people that have dedicated their lives to educating kids. And I don't know, it's a horror story.
Okay, thank you. Judy, I mean, one of the questions in terms of things like the brain drain and the funding and so on, I'm hearing stories about people wanting to leave the province rather than try and work under this system. And can you give me a sense of whether this is going to have an impact on First Nation schools being able to get teachers and principals?
Yes, well, we're already seeing that currently. They're actually coming together, a whole bunch of First Nations communities, because that's a really big problem right now. They just can't find teachers to come into some communities, and it's very scary not being able to source teachers for your schools. And they do have a plan in action to try and see how they can collaborate and try and entice people to come to Manitoba. So very scary. One of the things that doesn't help is that when you're looking at resources for kids, you get about 9,000 per student, as opposed to where you're out here, where you're looking at 16,000 per student. So right there, that means that your salary is going to help pay the janitor or pay the receptionist, because you're only allowed a certain amount to use on salaries for teachers. So that's are we going to be impacted even further yet? So, that's a very scary thought when it comes to retaining our progress that we've made regarding Indigenous culture, and for the Hutterites, what progress they have made. It would be so nice if there was collaborations there where we could learn about all the cultures and to be able to understand where everybody's coming from. But we just don't see that currently. But there was hope that we could eventually get to that kind of level under the current system that we have. But with this dismantling, who knows? Ben Carr brought up some very good points about Steinbach area, and when I was bragging about being on PAC, it was because I made it so that I could be that thorn in everyone's side, because my second and third child, they were very targeted. They couldn't finish. They actually didn't finish high school. We had to go to adult ed. We have to wait for them to go through adult education because they weren't supported in their school. And they're the reasons why I joined PAC. My second is transgender and could never come out in that system, never felt supported. And my other one had mental health issues and, was targeted by teachers, was targeted by a very racist teacher himself, and didn't feel supported in school. So it was very hard to get either of them in a school system. So I joined the PACs, and I was just that voice of the devil. I wasn't scared. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to cause upset and to ensure that no other kids, whether they were Indigenous or Hutterite or Mennonite, had to go through what my kids went through. And so I brought a lot of issues. I posed a lot of questions. I made people think, and people did drop from PAC probably because of me, but that's good. And I felt it was great because, you know, their voices weren't the ones that were eventually getting to others. No, we ought to be these little thorns every now and again. There's a lot of issues that this bill is bringing up, and it's just all very frightening. But we need to, you know, put that fright, the fear aside, and start getting some ideas from grassroots people and how to combat this. You know, how to ensure that we can survive another bill that's being imposed on us, because it's bound to happen.
All right. Thank you, Judy. I'm going to bring this to a close, but we're going to ask Dougal Dumont to say a word or two, if you can come on, Dougal. Just before you do that, anybody who would like information about where to get access to the petition or links to getting a no to Bill 64 sign, can you on the chat send a message directly to David Mintz or to Shandy Strong, and we'll make sure you get that information. Dougal, over to you to wind up. And after Dougal is done, I'm going to stay around, but in case there's anybody who wants to chat, but all the other panelists are free to move on. And thank you so much for joining us, Dougal.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I just want to, it is important. I just want to, you know, sum up a bit, but also by saying it is important to know what we're up against. So about a year ago, we found out that in the middle of April, in the middle of the first wave of the pandemic, that then Education Minister Kelvin Gertsen was on a webinar, and it was supposed to be for global homeschooling, it was called. And he was on a webinar, and there was a representative from Betsy DeVos, and Ted Cruz was there, and people from Brazil and Russia. And it was sort of a mix of the global alt-right, some people from countries with truly shocking policies. And one of the people there was also a representative from an American group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. And what ALEC does is it writes model bills. It comes up with model bills and talking points and ideas and strategy for how to dismantle public education and public health care and undermine democracy. I mean, it really is insidious. And this was something, you know, this bill, Bill 64, was introduced by Kelvin Gertsen as a blank bill, one of the blank bills back in November when he was still Minister of Education. So this is his legislation. And he's now Deputy Premier and Minister of Legislative Affairs. This is his doing. And we need to understand this isn't just a question of, well, how are we going to negotiate? How are we going to deal with this? This is bigger, that they really are trying to do something that is much more radical and pretending that it isn't, right? So when Brian Pallister talks about doing bold things, he's very seldom specific about it, but this is about blowing up the K-12 education system. And it's not just because people don't, it's not just because they want people to go to private schools, it's because they don't believe in public schools. They don't believe in public schools. They don't believe all the ideas that we need to help people out who are worse off for some reason or another. So one of the things they'll keep saying is, well, we spend the most and we have the worst results. Well, we don't spend the most. And for 80% of the students, our results are as good as or better than anywhere else in Canada. It's the 20% who've been left behind, and who have been left behind systematically by governments in Manitoba living in poverty, or they don't, or they've got literacy issues. There's a reason why they're living in poverty. And it may be that they were failed not just by this government, but by governments before, but especially about lifting people out of poverty. But there's been no serious effort to do anything about that at the provincial level in 30 years. And so when you look at what the PC government is doing, they are following a plan. They are following a blueprint. And one of the blueprints is to say, well, we're going to introduce so many bills, we can't deal with all of them at once. So they've done that. The other is they are sort of mixing together the property tax thing. I couldn't figure out, why is it that Brian Pallister is announcing all these property taxes? Well, so we talk about that and not about what's happening when he's blowing up the K-12 system. Why is he choosing to do massive property tax cuts in the middle of a recession? It's a tax cut program that will overwhelmingly benefit himself and other people who own lots of property, and people who don't own property are all going to be left behind. It doesn't make sense except as a distraction. So we do need to be very serious about understanding what we have to do. But the other thing about this is that this is a very unpopular government. Brian Pallister may go, but there are other people in his party who want to be reelected. So part of this is getting organized and saying we demand a referendum. And we don't just demand a referendum in Winnipeg. We demand a referendum whether it's in Steinbach or Morden or Brandon or Dauphin or any other place else where people normally or often vote PC. Because this is bad for PC voters. This is bad for every single constituency in Manitoba. It's bad for the children of PC voters and the grandchildren of PC voters. It's bad for the economies of rural Manitoba that depend on having a quality local school. If you want a business, if I want to start a business out in Rossburn, if I want to start a business in Dauphin, what do I want? I want to make sure that I've got a good school there that I can send my kids to. And if I can't do that, what am I going to do? This is about massive centralization of power. And we talked to Sharon Carstairs. She just said it was very funny. She asked to see it because she was a teacher as well as being the former leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party. And she said, look, most of the stuff in the K-12 review is apple pie that I've been hearing since I first started teaching in 1965. The rest of it is a massive power grab. And what they're looking at, why wouldn't you just get, if you were going to run the government, the provincial government, the way they're proposing what to do for the education system, it's like saying, well, we're just going to get rid of all the MLAs and the premier just gets to pick the cabinet. That's basically what we're looking at for our education system. So it's been postponed to October. It gives us time to organize, but the important thing is let people know, look, it hasn't passed yet, and we have time to let this government know that under no way, if they're going to try to pass this, we're going to make this as difficult as possible for them. And that starts with saying we want to have a referendum. So let your friends, your family, your parents know. Email your school trustees and tell them to sign the referendum. You say you want a referendum. Tell your MLA, if they're not a Liberal MLA, let them know you want to have a referendum as well. Because I'm not a huge fan of referendums or referenda, but on something like this is about one of the most important things the provincial government does. The PCs never ran on it, and they're going to take away people's right to vote and have a say in their own community. And that isn't something that should happen at a committee. That's something that needs to happen. They need to have if they really believe in this, they need to have a public mandate for it, and they don't. And that's what we feel. And so we'll just keep pushing, order your signs, keep pushing for the referendum, and we will as well. Because ultimately, there is a point when if you push them hard enough, they will blink. They do have a majority, but a majority is not the same thing as having moral authority, which they don't have. So thank you very much to everybody for your questions, your comments. This was really wonderful. And yes, keep the faith. It ain't over till it's over. So thank you so much, everyone.